Her plan was simple, if a little crazy. Pay a handsome stranger $1,000 to pose as her new boyfriend for one night. The goal, to shatter the smug, condescending smirk of her ex, a man who thought he'd left her with nothing. She just needed someone to look the part, to stand by her side and prove she'd moved on. What she found was a quiet, intense man in a worn-out jacket who needed the cash. But at the most opulent charity gala of the year, her carefully constructed charade implodes in a way she never imagined. Because her rented date wasn't just playing a part. He was a king in disguise, and she had just walked him straight into a war she had no idea how to fight. The invitation felt less like a request and more like a beautifully calligraphed dare. Embossed on thick, cream-coloured cardstock, the details for the annual Starlight Foundation Gala glittered under the fluorescent lights of Audrey Rowe's small design studio. It was the social event of the New York autumn season, a place where old money and new tech collided in a flurry of couture and champagne. It was also the place where he would be. Graham Pembroke, her ex. The man who had meticulously dissected her dreams called her interior design business a cute little hobby, and then left her for Chloe Vanderbilt, a woman whose primary occupation was being a Vanderbilt. "You're not actually going, are you?" Jessica Chen, Audrey's best friend and occasional bookkeeper, asked, peering over her laptop. "That's not an invitation. It's a beautifully packaged panic attack." Audrey traced the gold lettering with her finger. "I have to, Jess. Rowe Designs donated a consultation package for the charity auction. It's a good networking opportunity." Jess snorted. "You hate networking. You want to see him. You want to walk in there with your head held high and a dress that makes him regret the day he learned to breathe." She wasn't wrong. The thought of Graham seeing her successful and unbothered was a siren song she couldn't ignore. For 2 years he had been her world. He'd loved her ambition until it started to rival his own. He'd charmed her with tales of his future as a titan of private equity, a future in which she was meant to be a beautiful, supportive accessory. When she'd poured her life savings into starting Rowe Designs, he'd smiled that patronizing smile and said, "It's good to have a passion project." After he'd ended things via a curt, impersonal text message, she'd seen photos of him and Chloe in Vanity Fair 2 weeks later. The problem, as Jess had so astutely pointed out, was the head held high part. Going alone would make her look pitiful in his eyes. He would swoop in with his faux concern, Chloe clinging to his arm like a designer parasite, and he would kill her with kindness while his eyes screamed, "See, you can't manage without me." The idea, when it struck, was born of pure, undiluted desperation. It came to her 3 days before the gala while she was sitting in the Daily Grind, a coffee shop in Soho that was far too expensive, but made a latte that could momentarily solve all of life's problems. She was sketching a concept for a new client, trying to ignore the knot of dread in her stomach when a man walked in. He wasn't the usual Soho type. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit or trendy distressed sneakers. He wore scuffed work boots, faded jeans, and a simple, dark grey Henley that stretched across a broad chest and strong shoulders. There was a smudge of what looked like sawdust on his jawline. He was ruggedly handsome with intense, deep-set hazel eyes that seemed to be taking in everything at once. He ordered a black coffee, no room for cream, and paid with a crumpled $10 bill. He sat at a small table near the window, pulling out a worn leather-bound notebook and a mechanical pencil. He wasn't on a phone. He was sketching. Intricate technical drawings of what looked like joinery or structural supports. He was focused, completely absorbed in his work. Audrey found herself staring. There was a quiet confidence about him, an aura of self-containment that was the complete antithesis of Graham's performative bravado. And then she overheard it. His phone buzzed, and he answered with a low, slightly rough voice. "Yeah." "No, the shipment of reclaimed oak was delayed again." "I know, but I'm not compromising on the materials. Look, I'm a little short on liquid funds until the trust clears next month. I'll figure it out. I always do." He hung up, letting out a frustrated sigh. Short on liquid funds. The insane, reckless movie plot idea solidified in her brain. It was idiotic. It was dangerous. It was perfect. Taking a deep breath, Audrey stood up, walked over to his table, and said the words that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. "Excuse me," she began, her heart hammering against her ribs. "This is going to sound incredibly strange, but I have a business proposition for you." He looked up from his notebook, and those intense hazel eyes were even more piercing up close. He didn't smile. He just waited, his gaze neutral, assessing. "I need to hire an escort for a gala on Saturday night." She blurted out, wincing at the word. Not for that. I just need a date. A fake boyfriend, someone to accompany me to an event. I'll pay you $1,000 for 5 hours of your time." He blinked slowly. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but a flicker of amusement. "You want to pay me $1,000 to be your date?" Yes, she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. There's someone I need to make an impression on. You're handsome. You look like you don't try too hard. You clean up well, I assume. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. The movement made his biceps strain against the sleeves of his shirt. And what makes you think I'd be good at this? What if I'm a terrible actor? The less you say, the better, Audrey said, her confidence growing. Just stand next to me, look vaguely admiringly at me, and if my ex approaches, be aloof and a little mysterious. Can you do aloof and mysterious? He considered this for a long moment. His eyes scanned her face, and she felt strangely exposed, as if he could see right through her flimsy bravado to the raw hurt underneath. What's your name? He asked, his voice a low baritone. Audrey Rowe. Nathaniel. But I go by Nate. He extended a hand. His grip was firm, his palm calloused. And what's the story? What do I do for a living? She hadn't thought that far ahead. Something impressive but niche, so he can't ask too many follow-up questions. You're an antiquarian horologist. You restore rare antique clocks. It was the most obscure, ridiculous thing she could think of. A genuine smile finally broke through his stoic expression, transforming his face. It was a stunning, disarming smile. An antique clock restorer. Okay. And how did we meet? Through a mutual friend, at a wine tasting in the Finger Lakes. Very romantic. He nodded slowly. $1,000 you said cash, $500 up front, $500 at the end of the night. He looked down at his notebook, then back at her. The amusement was still in his eyes, but there was something else there too, curiosity. All right, Audrey Rowe, you've got yourself a date. But on one condition. What's that? I buy my own suit? You can't have your fake clock-restoring boyfriend showing up in a rental. He pulled a pen from his pocket. Give me your number. I'll text you about measurements. As she walked out of the coffee shop, her own number scribbled on a napkin in his hand, Audrey felt a dizzying mix of terror and triumph. She had just hired a complete stranger, a construction worker or a carpenter, to go up against Graham Pembroke in the heart of Manhattan high society. It was the stupidest, most impulsive thing she had ever done, and she couldn't wait. The 3 days leading up to the gala were a blur of anxious preparation. Audrey bought a dress, a deep emerald silk gown that was more expensive than her monthly rent, but clung to her curves in a way that screamed confidence. She had her hair and makeup professionally done. She was building her armor for the battle to come. Nate, true to his word, handled his own attire. He texted her for his measurements with a disarming straightforwardness, and then went silent for 2 days. Audrey was half convinced he wouldn't show up, that he'd take the $500 she'd wired him as an advance and disappear, leaving her stranded and humiliated. But on Saturday evening at precisely 7 o'clock, the buzzer to her apartment rang. When she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. Standing in her hallway was Nate, but it wasn't the man from the coffee shop. The rugged carpenter had been replaced by a man of breathtaking elegance. He was wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that made his shoulders look even broader. His hair was slightly tamed, his jaw was clean-shaven, and the only remnants of his former appearance were the intensity in his hazel eyes and an expensive-looking yet understated watch on his wrist. It wasn't flashy, but it looked solid, heavy, and real. He looked less like a hired date and more like he owned the entire building. Wow, Audrey breathed out. The suit, it's perfect. I clean up okay, he said, his lips twitching into that small smile. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering for a moment. And you, Audrey Rowe, look like you're about to start a war. Just a small one, she replied, grabbing her clutch. The ride to the venue, a lavishly decorated ballroom at the Pierre Hotel, was surprisingly comfortable. Nate didn't ask too many questions. He simply let her brief him. His name is Graham Pembroke, she explained, twisting the strap of her clutch. He'll be with Chloe Vanderbilt. He's tall, unfairly handsome, and has this way of smiling at you like he's just forgiven you for being an idiot. He'll try to get under your skin. Your job is to be unimpressed. Unimpressed. Got it, Nate said, his eyes on the glittering Manhattan skyline. And I'm Nate the horologist. Right. And if he asks about your work, just say it's highly technical and involves a lot of German-made tools. That'll shut him up. When they arrived, the scene was even more intimidating than Audrey had imagined. Flashbulbs went off as society figures stepped out of black cars. Inside, the air hummed with power and wealth. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. Audrey's confidence wavered, but then Nate placed a firm, warm hand on the small of her back. You've got this, he murmured, his voice close to her ear. The simple gesture was grounding a silent anchor in a sea of judgment. They made their way through the crowd, accepting glasses of champagne from a passing waiter. Nate moved with an easy grace that belied his coffee shop persona. He didn't gawk at the opulence. He seemed completely at ease, as if this were his natural habitat. People looked at him, their gazes filled with curiosity. Who was this handsome unknown man with Audrey Rowe? It didn't take long to find them. Graham and Chloe were holding court near the silent auction tables. Graham, in his custom Tom Ford tux, looked every bit the master of the universe. Chloe was preening in a gaudy, feather-covered dress. Graham saw her first. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, taking in her dress, her confidence, and most of all the man standing beside her. He whispered something to Chloe, and the two of them started gliding their way over their smiles wide and predatory. Audrey, I wasn't sure you'd make it, Graham said, his voice oozing feigned delight. He kissed the air next to her cheek. You look... well. The subtext was clear. You look well for someone I discarded. Graham. Chloe. Lovely to see you, Audrey said, her voice steadier than she expected. Graham's eyes immediately shifted to Nate, sizing him up with a look that was pure condescending appraisal. And you are? Nate didn't offer his hand. He simply gave a slight nod. Nate. Nate, Graham repeated, tasting the name. Audrey, you must introduce us properly. What does Nate do? Here it was. The moment of truth. Nate's a horologist, Audrey said smoothly. Graham's brow furrowed. A what? He restores antique timepieces, Audrey explained. Graham let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Clocks? How? Quaint. Is there much of a market for that these days? Nate, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was calm and level, yet it cut through Graham's smugness like a knife. It's a niche market, but the clients are discerning. They value craftsmanship and history over disposable trends. Much like architecture, wouldn't you agree? A Patek Philippe from 1950 has more integrity than 1,000 glass and steel monstrosities thrown up in a year. He glanced meaningfully around the historic ballroom. Graham was taken aback. He fancied himself a connoisseur of luxury, but he was clearly out of his depth. He didn't know how to respond to such a specific, confident assertion. Right, Graham stammered, recovering. Well, we're all so happy you're... Moving on, Audrey. Chloe and I were just saying how important it is for people to find their own level. The insult was delivered with a perfect smile. Before Audrey could retort, an older, distinguished-looking man with a mane of silver hair approached their group. His eyes lit up when he saw Nate. Nate. My boy. What in God's name are you doing here? The man boomed, clapping Nate on the shoulder with genuine affection. I thought you'd gone off the grid. Last I heard you were in Wyoming building a cabin with your bare hands. Audrey froze. Graham and Chloe turned to look at the newcomer. Audrey recognized him from the business page as Walter Finch, the legendary founder of Finch Industries, a corporate titan worth billions. Nate smiled that rare, genuine smile. Walter, good to see you. Just taking a break? Enjoying the city? Walter Finch laughed. A break? Son, you sell your company for $3 billion. You're allowed more than a break. You're allowed to buy your own planet. He then turned his attention to the stunned group. Don't tell me you folks don't know who this is. This is Nathaniel Calloway, the man behind Calloway Dynamics, the one who revolutionized data encryption. He's the reason half the people in this room can do their banking securely. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Audrey stared at Nate, her mind refusing to process the words. Nathaniel Calloway, Calloway Dynamics, $3 billion, the sawdust on his jaw, the worn-out jacket, the need for $1,000. It didn't make any sense. Graham's face had gone completely pale, the color draining from his cheeks as if he'd seen a ghost. His smug superiority evaporated, replaced by a look of horrified disbelief. Chloe Vanderbilt looked from Graham to Nate, her perfectly painted mouth hanging slightly agape. Walter Finch, oblivious to the drama he had just detonated, clapped Nate on the back again. Well, don't be a stranger, son. We need to talk about my foundation's new tech initiative. He nodded at the group and moved on. An excruciating silence descended. Nate looked at Audrey, his expression unreadable. He had known this could happen. He had played his part, and now the curtain had been pulled back. Graham was the first to speak, his voice a choked whisper. Calloway. The Nathaniel Calloway. Nate's gaze shifted to him, and it was cold as ice. He didn't answer the question. Instead, he looked at Audrey, his voice softening slightly. Are you ready to go? I think we've made the impression you were hoping for. He placed his hand on her back again, a gesture of ownership and protection that was no longer part of the act. As he guided her away, leaving Graham and Chloe standing there like statues, Audrey could feel every eye in the room on them. She had wanted to upset her ex. She had wanted to make him feel small. But she had just dropped a nuclear bomb on his entire world, and she had no idea who the man holding her was or what kind of fallout was coming her way. The silence in the back of the town car was heavier than the city air. Audrey sat rigidly on the plush leather seat, staring at her hands, her mind reeling. The emerald dress suddenly felt like a cheap costume. The entire night, her meticulously planned revenge had been a farce built on a foundation she hadn't understood. Nathaniel Calloway. She replayed their first meeting in her head, the scuffed boots, the talk of being short on funds, the easy acceptance of her $1,000 offer. It was a performance, a masterful one. He hadn't lied to her, not directly. He had simply allowed her to believe the narrative she had created for him. Why, she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why would you do that? The money? It was a joke to you. Nate was looking out the window, his jaw tight. It wasn't a joke, and your situation didn't feel like a joke. He turned to face her, his hazel eyes serious. I sold my company 6 months ago. Since then, every single person I've met knows my net worth before they know my name. They don't see me. They see a walking, talking bank account. Women, old friends, business associates. It's all transactional. They all want something. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. You walked up to me in that coffee shop and you didn't see a billionaire. You saw a guy in a work shirt who you thought you could trust to have your back for a night. You offered me a deal. A straightforward, honest transaction. It was the most real conversation I'd had in months. I was intrigued. Intrigued? Audrey's voice rose, a bubble of hysteria rising in her chest. You were intrigued, Nate. You let me walk you into that gala like a show pony. I was trying to prove I wasn't a fool who'd been dumped by a rich guy, and I did it by hiring a man who could buy Graham's entire company with his pocket change. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? More humiliating than him seeing you alone and miserable? Nate countered, his voice remaining level. Audrey, your plan worked. You wanted to get under his skin. You wanted to prove you'd moved on to bigger and better things. Mission accomplished, I'd say. That's not the point. She shot back. The point is, it was all a lie, and not even my lie. It was yours. My privacy is not a lie, he said, his tone hardening slightly. I was renovating an old brownstone I own in the village. By myself. I like working with my hands. It's real. The trust fund I have for my personal projects hadn't cleared yet, and I was genuinely short on liquid cash for a shipment of materials. Your $1,000 was going to pay for it. She stared at him dumbfounded. A billionaire who did his own construction and had cash flow problems. It sounded like something out of a fantasy novel. The car pulled up outside her modest apartment building. The spell of the tuxedo and the town car was broken. This was her reality, a fourth-floor walk-up and a business she was struggling to keep afloat. Keep the other $500, she said numbly, grabbing her clutch and moving to open the door. Nate's hand shot out gently, touching her arm. Audrey. Wait. She stopped, but she didn't look at him. I'm sorry if I embarrassed you, he said, and his voice was sincere. That wasn't my intention. I enjoyed tonight, before Walter showed up anyway. I enjoyed being your horologist. She finally turned to look at him. In the dim light of the car, she could see the conflict in his eyes. He wasn't the untouchable titan Graham saw. He was just a man, albeit a ridiculously complicated and wealthy one. Good night, Nate, she said softly, and got out of the car before she could do something stupid like cry. She didn't hear from him for 2 days. She tried to throw herself back into work, but her mind kept replaying the scene at the gala. The look on Graham's face was seared into her memory, a cocktail of shock, fury, and utter humiliation. A small vindictive part of her was thrilled, but a much larger part was terrified. Graham Pembroke was not a man who took humiliation well. He was a predator, and she had wounded his pride. Wounded predators were the most dangerous. The first shot was fired on Tuesday morning. Audrey was in a meeting with Mr. Peterson, the head of development for a boutique hotel chain. The Peterson project was her biggest contract to date, the one that would finally put Rowe Designs on the map and out of the red. They were in the final stages of approving her designs for the hotel's lobby and suites. Mr. Peterson, who had always been warm and enthusiastic, was suddenly distant and evasive. Audrey, we have to talk, he said, avoiding her eyes. There's been a change of plans. We're putting the project on hold indefinitely. Audrey's blood ran cold. On hold, but we were about to sign the final papers. What happened? Is it a budget issue? It's more of a risk management issue, Peterson said, shuffling papers on his desk. Our primary investors, a private equity firm called Pembroke Capital, have raised some concerns. They flagged your company as a potential liability. Something about your financial instability and lack of a long-term track record. Pembroke Capital. Graham's firm. The air left her lungs. My financials are solid for a new business, she argued, her voice trembling slightly. You've seen my books. You know my work. My hands are tied, Audrey Peterson said, his voice full of false sympathy. Pembroke's group is the majority investor. Their word is final. I'm truly sorry. Audrey walked out of the high-rise office building in a daze. The bustling New York street seemed to fade into a dull roar. This wasn't just a setback, it was a kill shot. The Peterson project was 90% of her projected income for the next year. Without it, her business would be bankrupt in 6 months. Graham hadn't just gotten angry. He had declared war. He hadn't come after her personally. He'd targeted the one thing that meant more to her than anything, her dream, her independence. He was going to dismantle her life piece by piece just to prove that he could. That evening, sitting in her studio surrounded by blueprints and fabric samples that were now meaningless, she finally let the tears fall. She had won the battle at the gala, but she was about to lose everything that mattered. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "I heard about the Peterson contract. Don't panic, he's made a mistake." And she stared at the message, a fresh wave of conflicting emotions washing over her. Anger, resentment, and a tiny, treacherous spark of hope. Nathaniel Calloway had dropped a bomb into her life and walked away. Now he was back acting like he could fix it with a text message. She didn't want his help. She didn't want his pity. She didn't want a billionaire savior. But as she looked at the stack of unpaid invoices on her desk, she had to face a terrifying truth: she might not have a choice. Audrey didn't reply to Nate's text. Pride, stubborn and fierce, wouldn't let her. This was her fight. She had started it with her desperate, foolish plan, and she would finish it. She spent the next 3 days in a frantic state of damage control. She called every potential client in her Rolodex, followed up on old leads, and tried to downsize her project budgets. But the industry was small. The news about the Peterson contract withdrawal, especially the whispers of financial instability, had spread like poison. Doors that were once open were now politely but firmly closed. On the 4th day, when she was surviving on coffee and despair, her office buzzer rang. Expecting a courier with another return sample book, she buzzed them up without asking who it was. A few moments later, there was a soft knock on her studio door. It was Nate. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo or a work shirt. He was dressed in dark, well-fitting jeans, a simple black sweater, and a leather jacket. He looked casual, but the air of quiet power was still there. In his hands, he held 2 large cups of coffee and a paper bag that smelled deliciously of fresh pastries. "I figured you could use this," he said, his expression neutral. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, placing the coffee and bag on her large drafting table, his eyes taking in the chaotic state of her studio. He saw the piles of paperwork, the frantic sketches for non-existent projects. He saw her exhaustion. "I told you not to panic," he said gently. "And I'm not panicking," Audrey retorted, crossing her arms defensively. "I'm strategizing, and I don't need you to bring me pity coffee." "It's not pity coffee," he said, pushing one of the cups towards her. "It's you're going to burn yourself out coffee. And a croissant. You look like you haven't eaten." She wanted to throw him out. She wanted to scream at him for his role in this mess. But she was so tired, and the smell of the coffee was a siren's call. She reluctantly took the cup. "What do you want, Nate? I want to help," he said simply. "I don't want your money," she snapped. "You can't just buy me a new contract. That would prove Graham right, that I need a rich man to solve my problems." "I agree," he said, surprising her. He sat on the edge of her drafting table, a clear violation of her personal space, yet it didn't feel threatening. "Throwing money at this is lazy. And it's not what you need. You need an opportunity, not a handout. You need to win on your own merits." She looked at him confused. "So why are you here?" "Because Graham isn't playing fair. He's using leverage and lies to shut you down. I'm just going to level the playing field." He pulled out his phone. "I did some digging. Pembroke Capital doesn't just invest in hotel chains. One of their biggest partners is a media conglomerate that owns several high-profile design and architecture magazines. Graham is ensuring that not only can you not get work, but no one will even see the work you've already done." Audrey sank into her chair, the weight of it all crashing down on her. He was strangling her career from every conceivable angle. "What can I do?" she whispered, the fight draining out of her. "You can let me make a phone call," Nate said, "not as a billionaire throwing his weight around, but as someone who knows people, people who value talent over petty grudges, people who Graham can't touch." She hesitated. It felt like a surrender. "Audrey," Nate said, his voice soft but firm. "Men like Graham count on their victims being too proud or too scared to fight back with the same weapons. He's using his network. It's time you used one too. Let me be your network." She looked into his eyes and saw no pity. She saw respect. She saw a partner offering a tool, not a prince offering a rescue. With a slow, reluctant nod, she gave him her consent. Nate made the call right there in her studio. He didn't pace or raise his voice. He just spoke in low, confident tones to someone he called Robert. He didn't mention Graham or the sabotage. He simply talked about an incredibly gifted interior designer named Audrey Rowe, whose innovative work on a new hotel concept he'd seen. He mentioned her fresh perspective on sustainable luxury and her unique aesthetic. He made her sound like the future of the industry. Robert's the head of acquisitions for the Sovereign Group, Nate explained after he hung up. They're a global hospitality giant. They're launching a new line of ultra-luxury eco-lodges. They've been looking for a designer who can bring a unique vision to the table, someone not from the usual pool of established names. He's going to look at your online portfolio tonight. The Sovereign Group. Audrey gasped. They were legendary. Working for them was a career-making dream. They'll never hire me. I'm too small. Let them be the judge of that, Nate said. He took a bite of a pastry from the bag. In the meantime, I saw the blueprints for the Peterson project you had pinned to the wall. The atrium design using the reclaimed wood and the living wall. It's brilliant, but you have a structural flaw in the load-bearing calculations for the central staircase. Audrey stared at him. What? How would you know that? He walked over to the blueprints, pointing with his finger. This support here. You're using a standard 10-inch beam, but with the type of wood you've specified, and the cantilevered design, you'll get micro fractures within 5 years. You need to reinforce it with a concealed steel I-beam or switch to a laminated veneer lumber. I'd recommend the latter for the aesthetic. She looked at her own designs, then at him, her mind spinning. He wasn't just a tech genius, the man who sketched in the coffee shop, the man renovating his own brownstone. It wasn't a hobby. He understood this on a level she hadn't expected. My degree was in structural engineering, he said, answering her unspoken question. Before I got sidetracked with coding. Old habits. Over the next week, an unspoken routine developed. Nate would show up at her studio in the late afternoon, coffee in hand. He wouldn't interfere, but he'd sit and work on his own laptop, managing his vast invisible empire, she presumed, while she obsessively refined her portfolio. When she got stuck on a technical problem, she would ask, and he would offer a solution with quiet, devastating competence. He wasn't just a silent guardian, he was becoming a collaborator. They talked. She told him about her passion for design, how she loved creating spaces that made people feel something. He told her about the crushing pressure of running a multi-billion-dollar company, the isolation at the top, and his profound need to build something tangible with his own hands again. He was funny, surprisingly down to earth, and a ridiculously good listener. The line between gratitude and something deeper began to blur. Then, on a Friday afternoon, she got the email. It was from Robert Sterling at the Sovereign Group. They had been exceptionally impressed with her portfolio. They wanted to fly her to their headquarters in Chicago next week to present a preliminary concept for their flagship eco-lodge in Costa Rica. She had an audience. She had a chance. She looked across the studio at Nate, who was concentrating on his screen. The raw, desperate anger she had felt towards him had been replaced by a confusing, heart-thumping warmth. He had leveled the playing field, just as he'd promised. He had given her a weapon to fight back. But as she booked her flight to Chicago, a cold dread settled in her stomach. Graham wasn't a man who accepted defeat. When he found out she had bypassed his blockade, he wouldn't just be angry. He would be incandescent with rage. This wasn't the end of the war. It was just the beginning of a much deadlier battle. The week in Chicago was a whirlwind. Audrey poured every ounce of her talent and energy into her presentation for the Sovereign Group. She barely slept, fueled by the same coffee and adrenaline that had gotten her through her final exams in design school. She was competing against 2 other much larger firms, but Nate's quiet confidence had become a mantra in her mind. Let them be the judge of that. When she stood before the board of directors, a panel of stern-faced executives, she didn't talk about fabrics and color palettes. She talked about her philosophy. She spoke of creating a space that felt like it grew out of the Costa Rican jungle itself, using locally sourced materials, sustainable energy, and a design that blurred the line between indoors and outdoors. She presented sketches, 3D renderings, and a budget so meticulously planned it left no room for doubt. She flew back to New York in a state of suspended animation, not knowing if she had succeeded or failed. Nate met her at the airport. He didn't ask how it went. He just took her bag, guided her to his waiting car, a surprisingly understated black Audi, not a flashy supercar, and drove her home. The simple, solid presence of him was the only thing keeping her anxiety at bay. 2 days later, the call came. Robert Sterling from Sovereign offered her the contract. Not just for the flagship lodge, but for the entire line of 5 eco-resorts being built over the next 3 years. It was a multi-million-dollar deal that would not only save her company, but catapult it into the global elite. When she told Nate, his smile was one of pure, unadulterated pride. "I knew you could do it," he said. And in that moment, the last of her reservations about him melted away. He pulled her into a hug, and she buried her face in his shoulder, laughing and crying at the same time. The hug lingered, transforming from celebratory to something more intimate, more charged. When they finally pulled apart, the space between them was electric. The fake relationship had somewhere along the way become terrifyingly real. But their celebration was short-lived. The news of Audrey's contract with Sovereign sent shockwaves through the industry, and it didn't take long for Graham to hear about it. His reaction was swift and vicious. He couldn't attack her financially anymore. Sovereign's legal and financial teams were impenetrable fortresses. So he decided to attack the only thing he had left: her reputation. A week after she signed the contract, a story appeared on Urban Gaze, a popular and notoriously ruthless industry blog. The headline was explosive: newcomer designer Audrey Rowe accused of corporate espionage and fraud. The article, citing anonymous sources close to the situation, painted a sickening picture. It claimed Audrey had stolen key design concepts for the Sovereign project from her previous work with the Peterson Hotel Group. It insinuated that she had falsified parts of her portfolio and used a wealthy benefactor to improperly influence the Sovereign board. It was a character assassination skillfully written to sound plausible, filled with just enough industry jargon to seem credible. It didn't mention Graham or Nate by name, but the implications were crystal clear. The fallout was immediate. Audrey's phone blew up with calls from reporters. Her email inbox was flooded with messages, some supportive, but many filled with vitriol. The comments on the blog post were a cesspool of accusations and judgment. Sovereign's PR department called, assuring her they stood by her, but warning her that the board was concerned about the negative press. This was Graham's endgame. He couldn't destroy her business, so he was going to destroy her name, her credibility, the very essence of her talent. He was poisoning her dream, making her victory feel like a crime. Audrey was shattered. She locked herself in her studio, unable to face the world. This time, when Nate arrived, she didn't even have the strength to be angry. She just sat on the floor, the hateful words of the article glowing on her laptop screen. Nate read the article, his expression growing darker with every sentence. When he finished, he didn't offer words of comfort. He radiated a cold, controlled fury that was more frightening than any outburst. "This is no longer about his pride," Nate said, his voice dangerously low. "This is libel. He's crossed a legal and ethical line, and he's done it publicly." "What can I do? It's my word against his anonymous sources," Audrey said, her voice hoarse. "You're going to do nothing," Nate replied, pulling out his phone. "You're going to sit here, drink some water, and start sketching ideas for Costa Rica. I'm going to end this." His tone left no room for argument. Audrey watched as he made a series of quiet, efficient calls. He wasn't talking to lawyers. He was talking to people she'd never heard of: a digital forensics expert named Spider, a former journalist named Anya, and finally, a man he addressed only as Mr. Davenport. The next afternoon, Nate came to her apartment. "There's a meeting," he said. "You need to be there." The meeting was held in a glass-walled conference room on the 50th floor of a skyscraper in the financial district. It was the headquarters of Pembroke Capital. When they walked in, Graham was already there, flanked by two of his firm's senior partners. One of them was a stern, silver-haired man who Nate greeted as Mr. Davenport. Graham looked shocked and furious to see Audrey and Nate. "What is the meaning of this? This is a private firm matter." "It is," Mr. Davenport said, his voice like gravel, "and your recent actions have made Miss Rowe's business our business. Please sit." What followed was not a shouting match, but a clinical, brutal execution. Nate didn't speak at first. He simply placed a tablet on the polished mahogany table and nodded to Mr. Davenport. On the screen was a detailed report. Graham, Mr. Davenport began, his eyes fixed on his subordinate. "We've been made aware of certain extracurricular activities you've engaged in. For instance, the pressure you exerted on the Peterson Hotel Group to terminate their contract with Rowe Designs. We have sworn affidavits from two of their board members who are concerned about the potential legal blowback." Graham's face went rigid. "Then there's this," Davenport continued, tapping the screen. "An article filled with baseless and defamatory accusations. Our forensic tech team, with a little help from Mr. Calloway's associate, traced the original IP address of the anonymous source who fed the story to the blog. It came from a temporary office you rented under a false name 2 blocks from here. We also have the full, unredacted email chain between you and the blogger, including your payment transfers." Nate finally spoke, his voice calm and deadly. "You didn't just libel Miss Rowe. You used company resources and your position at Pembroke Capital to wage a personal vendetta. You exposed this entire firm to a massive lawsuit, not to mention the reputational damage. Sovereign Group's legal team was preparing to file an injunction this afternoon that would have named Pembroke Capital as a co-conspirator. I convinced them to wait until after this meeting." Graham looked like he had been physically struck. He stared at Nate, then at Audrey, a look of pure hatred in his eyes. He had been so focused on ruining her that he never considered she had a protector who could ruin him 10 times over. He thought Nate was just money. He didn't realize Nate was strategy, information, and power. "You're finished here, Graham," Mr. Davenport said coldly. "Your resignation is effective immediately. We'll be generous and allow you to state you're leaving to pursue other opportunities. In return, you will issue a full public retraction and apology to Miss Rowe, and you will never contact her or interfere with her business again. If you refuse, Mr. Calloway will release his findings to the press, and our firm will sue you personally for damages. Is that clear?" Defeated, exposed, and utterly broken Graham Pembroke could only nod. He couldn't even look at Audrey as he stood up and walked out of the room, a titan reduced to a disgraced employee. As they rode the elevator down in silence, Audrey looked at Nate. He had just systematically dismantled a man's entire career, not with rage, but with cold, irrefutable facts. He had protected her not by hiding her, but by unmasking her attacker for the entire world to see. "It's over," he said, his hand finding hers, his fingers lacing through hers. She knew it was. The war was won. And now for the first time, she could look at the man beside her, not as a stranger, a client, or a protector, but as the person she was falling in love with. In the weeks that followed, Graham's public retraction and silent disappearance from the New York financial scene, a quiet calm settled over Audrey's life. The venomous blog post was replaced by an article praising her resilience and talent. The industry, ever fickle now, saw her as a rising star who had overcome a malicious rival. The contract with the Sovereign Group was her shield and her vindication, but the victory felt hollow without acknowledging the man who had orchestrated it. Her relationship with Nate existed in a strange limbo. He had become her confidant, her advisor, and her fiercest defender, but the foundation of their connection was still a lie, a $1,000 transaction in a coffee shop. The fake boyfriend had become a real protector, but what came next? One crisp autumn evening, Nate took her to the brownstone in Greenwich Village he was renovating. The exterior was classic New York, but inside it was a work in progress. The walls were stripped down to the original brick, the floors were bare planks of wide oak, and the air smelled of sawdust and fresh plaster. It was a beautiful, chaotic, promising mess. "This is it," he said, gesturing around the cavernous main floor. "This is my escape. When running Calloway Dynamics felt like I was living in a spreadsheet, I'd come here and remember what it felt like to build something real." He showed her his plan sketches that were as detailed and passionate as her own design renderings. He'd preserved the historic details, the crown molding the original fireplace, while designing a modern, open-concept living space with a 2-story library and a glass-walled garden room. "It's incredible, Nate," she said, genuinely awed. "It's a home." "It's a house," he corrected her gently. "It's not a home yet. It's missing something." He turned to face her, the evening light from the large uncovered windows casting long shadows around them. "It's missing you." Audrey's heart skipped a beat. "Audrey, everything that's happened between us started with a business deal," he said, his voice earnest. "It was a lie to fool Graham, but somewhere along the way it became the truest thing in my life. I'm not interested in being your guardian or your benefactor. I want to be your partner. I want to wake up with you, argue about blueprints with you, and build a life with you right here in this beautiful mess." Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in a long time, they weren't tears of fear or frustration. They were tears of overwhelming relief and happiness. "I was so afraid," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "I was afraid that this was all just a game to you, another problem for the billionaire to solve. The only problem I was trying to solve was how to get the brilliant, fiery designer from the coffee shop to see me as just Nate," he said, stepping closer and framing her face with his hands. "Not Nathaniel Calloway. Just Nate, the guy who really needed $1,000 for his reclaimed oak." She laughed through her tears. "You're an idiot." "I'm your idiot," he whispered, and then he kissed her. It wasn't a tentative, uncertain kiss. It was a kiss filled with all the unspoken words, the shared anxieties, and the quiet moments of connection they had shared over the past few months. It was a kiss that felt like a foundation being laid solid and true. In the months that followed, they didn't just build a house, they designed a life. Audrey brought her expertise to the brownstone, softening Nate's stark structural plans with warmth, color, and texture. She filled the space with light and life. In turn, Nate became an invaluable partner in her business, not with his money, but with his sharp strategic mind and unwavering belief in her talent. Rowe Designs flourished landing projects based purely on its own merit, with Audrey Rowe's name becoming synonymous with innovation and integrity. She had started with a desperate plan to borrow a stranger to upset her ex. She thought she was renting an actor for a night, a temporary shield against her own insecurity. What she found was a partner who didn't just protect her from the storm, but taught her how to build a shelter of her own, a man who saw her not as a project to be saved, but a design to be treasured. Standing with him in their finished home sunlight streaming through the windows, Audrey knew she hadn't just found a new life, she had built one from the ground up. And so Audrey's story comes to a close. It began with a simple, desperate act, a woman trying to reclaim her power from a man who had taken it. But it evolved into something so much more. It's a reminder that sometimes our most impulsive decisions, the ones born from rock bottom, can lead us to unexpected and beautiful places. It shows us that true strength isn't about the absence of fear, but about taking action despite it. And it proves that the best kind of partner isn't one who slays your dragons for you, but one who hands you a sword and helps you fight them yourself. What did you think of Audrey's journey? Could you ever imagine doing what she did? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of drama twists and finding love in the most unlikely of circumstances, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with a friend who loves a good story, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more content just like this. Thank you for listening.